Frances Hayes unfolded the last dollar she had left, creased neatly down the middle, the way her late husband had always taught her, and stared at the pharmacy counter. One heart pill, or one more day of hope. Then, a crash outside pulled her attention away. An elderly homeless man had collapsed face first onto the icy sidewalk, while strangers hurried past without slowing down. Frances closed her trembling hand around the dollar turned away from the medicine shelf and bought a carton of milk and a loaf of bread instead. Less than 12 hours later, a convoy of black SUVs stopped outside the rundown boarding house where she lived, and everything she believed about her lonely life was about to change. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if heartfelt stories about kindness, courage, and second chances mean something to you, consider subscribing so we can share many more together. Long before black SUVs lined the cracked curb outside her boarding house, before anyone whispered that fate had somehow remembered her name, Frances Hayes had mastered the quiet art of living with almost nothing. Every weekday morning at exactly 6:15, she woke before the alarm on her 30-year-old clock radio ever had the chance to buzz. Years of working in an elementary school cafeteria had trained her body better than any machine could. Even though she had retired nearly a decade earlier, she still rose with the same discipline. The tiny room she rented on the second floor of an aging Victorian house in Cleveland measured barely enough for a narrow bed, a wooden table, a single bookshelf, and a tiny kitchenette tucked into one corner. The wallpaper had begun peeling years ago, exposing faded layers beneath, but Frances always kept everything spotless. Poverty, she believed, was never an excuse to stop respecting the place where you laid your head at night. She filled an old kettle with tap water and waited for it to whistle. Coffee grounds had become too expensive months earlier. Instead, she brewed what she jokingly called memory coffee. Hot water mixed with roasted chicory that carried just enough bitterness to remind her of better mornings. She smiled faintly after the first sip. Still not as bad as Nathan used to make, she murmured to herself. Talking to her late husband had become another habit. Not because she believed he could answer, simply because silence sometimes felt heavier. Beside the chipped ceramic mug rested an old leather wallet. Time had softened its brown surface until it almost looked gray. The stitching had been repaired several times with different shades of thread. Inside that wallet were no credit cards, no photographs of vacations, no receipts from expensive dinners. Only 3 things remained: her driver's license, a faded picture of Nathan Hayes smiling beside a rust-colored pickup truck sometime in the late 1980s, and a single $1 bill folded perfectly in half. Every morning she unfolded it, smoothed it gently with her fingertips, then folded it again. Nathan had started that ritual during the hardest year of their marriage, when layoffs at the steel plant left him unemployed for almost 14 months. He used to laugh whenever money became tight. "If you fold a dollar with hope," he would tell her, pressing the crease carefully with his thumb, "someday it'll come back carrying a blessing." Back then, Frances had rolled her eyes. "A blessing won't pay the electric bill." Nathan would grin anyway. "No. But hope keeps people alive long enough to pay it." She had teased him for sounding like a preacher. Now, 21 years after his death, she still folded every last dollar exactly the way he had shown her. It was never about luck. It was about remembering who they had been before life took almost everything away. After finishing breakfast, a slice of toast spread with homemade apple butter she had received from another church volunteer, Frances wrapped a wool scarf around her neck and began the 15-minute walk toward St. Matthew's Community Church. The January wind swept across Cleveland with a sharpness that made every breath sting. She noticed familiar faces along the way. Mr. Donovan sweeping snow from the sidewalk outside his barber shop, a crossing guard waving children toward school, an elderly woman struggling to carry groceries. Frances crossed the street without hesitation. "May I help?" The woman smiled gratefully. "Oh, honey, you don't have to." "I know. But I can." 5 minutes later, Frances continued her walk, her arthritic fingers aching slightly from carrying 2 heavy grocery bags. She never considered kindness something that required spare wealth, only spare willingness. St. Matthew's sat between an abandoned laundromat and a small, family-owned bakery. Every Tuesday and Thursday, the church opened its basement to serve breakfast for anyone who needed one. Retired teachers stood beside former construction workers. College students volunteered next to veterans. Nobody asked questions. Everyone simply served. Pastor Samuel Carter greeted Frances with his usual smile. "Morning, Miss Hayes." "Morning, Pastor." "You look tired." "I've looked tired since 1998. He laughed. "I suppose that's true." She tied on a faded blue volunteer apron and immediately began arranging trays of scrambled eggs, toast, oatmeal, bananas, and hot coffee. She knew many guests by name. Walter preferred extra pepper. Maria always saved half her toast for her younger brother. Old Henry insisted on washing his own tray, despite arthritis that bent nearly every finger. These tiny routines mattered. People who had lost homes still deserved normal mornings. Around 9 o'clock after breakfast service ended, Frances helped clean tables while quietly catching her breath. Her chest tightened for a moment. Just a little. Nothing unusual. She reached into her coat pocket. The prescription bottle rattled softly. Only 1 heart pill remained. She stared at it longer than usual. Dr. Rebecca Collins had warned her only last month. "You can't keep skipping doses, Frances." "I know. The medication keeps your heart stable." "I understand. But understanding doesn't lower pharmacy prices." The doctor had looked away before answering. Frances had never blamed her. Doctors couldn't rewrite grocery bills, or rent, or utility statements. That afternoon, she stopped by the pharmacy before walking home. The pharmacist already knew her. "Hello, Mrs. Hayes." "Afternoon." He typed quietly into the register. "I'm afraid your insurance adjustment hasn't gone through yet." She nodded. "I figured." "The refill comes to $28.63. She opened the old wallet. Carefully, methodically. Inside were 3 quarters, 2 dimes, 1 nickel, and that folded dollar Nathan had taught her to treasure. Exactly $1.90, not even close. I'm sorry," the pharmacist said gently. "So am I." She closed the wallet without complaint. There was no scene, no anger, no pleading. Dignity often survives long after comfort disappears. Outside gray clouds rolled slowly across the winter sky. Frances looked toward the bus stop where dozens of strangers hurried through another ordinary day. She wondered not for the first time what her little boy might have looked like now. 37 years. 37 birthdays imagined. 37 Christmas mornings spent setting 1 extra plate on her heart, even if never on the table. The apartment fire had stolen everything in less than 12 minutes. Neighbors had escaped. Firefighters had searched. Authorities had concluded that 4-year-old Benjamin Hayes had most likely perished in the blaze after being separated during the chaos. No body had ever been recovered. People eventually stopped searching. Frances never truly did. Even now, every year on January 19th, she lit a small candle beside Nathan's photograph, not because she believed her son was alive, but because a mother's love has never needed proof to keep breathing. As evening settled over Cleveland, she tucked the folded dollar back into her wallet. It was all she had left. Tomorrow she would have to choose carefully what that single dollar could buy. She had no way of knowing that before another sunrise, that simple choice would begin changing 2 lives that had been separated for nearly 4 decades. While Frances Hayes measured each day by dollars bus schedules and the number of meals she could help serve at St. Matthew's Community Church, Another life unfolded less than 20 miles away behind walls of polished glass and steel. At exactly 7:30 every morning, the executive elevator opened onto the 32nd floor of Brooks Health Systems. People straightened their jackets when they heard the familiar chime. Conversation stopped. Coffee cups were quietly lowered. Not because Daniel Brooks demanded fear, because he respected time with almost painful precision, and everyone around him had learned to do the same. At 41, Daniel had become one of the youngest CEOs in Ohio to lead a Fortune 500 healthcare technology company. His software connected hospitals across the country, helping emergency rooms share patient information in seconds instead of hours. Newspapers often described him as visionary, disciplined, and relentless. Few described him as lonely. His office overlooked downtown Cleveland and the slow curve of Lake Erie beyond the skyline. The view was spectacular, yet Daniel rarely looked out the windows for more than a few seconds. Most mornings his attention drifted instead to a small, walnut box that remained locked inside the bottom drawer of his desk. He opened it only when he was alone. Inside lay two objects that seemed painfully ordinary: a faded blue plastic shirt button and half of a burned photograph. The photograph showed only part of a smiling young woman. Fire had blackened almost everything else. Daniel gently traced the rough edge where the picture had been torn decades ago. Every birthday, every Christmas, every major success. He found himself opening that same little box, not because it gave answers, because it reminded him that one question still had none. Who had his mother been? His adoptive parents, Richard and Helen Brooks, had never hidden the truth. "You were loved before you came to us," Helen used to tell him. "We know that much." She had explained everything she knew when Daniel turned 12. A devastating apartment fire. A frightened 4-year-old boy found wandering 3 blocks away after the evacuation. No identifying documents. No relatives located. Authorities believed his family had died in the blaze. Months later, after every legal search had ended, Richard and Helen adopted him. They loved him completely. Daniel never questioned that. Richard taught him integrity. Helen taught him compassion. Neither ever tried to replace the family he had lost. Instead, they honored them. Even after both of his adoptive parents passed away within 3 years of one another, Daniel continued searching for any trace of his biological family. Private investigators, archived newspapers, DNA databases, genealogists, old fire department records. Nothing ever produced certainty. Sometimes there were hopeful leads. Each eventually disappeared. The burned photograph and blue button remained his only physical connection to a life that existed before he could clearly remember it. At precisely 8 o'clock, Olivia Grant entered, carrying Daniel's schedule. She had worked beside him for 9 years and knew when something occupied his thoughts. "You didn't sleep much." "I slept." "You answered emails at 2:15? Daniel smiled faintly. "You really should stop checking timestamps." "I would if you stopped working at ridiculous hours." She placed several folders on his desk. "The quarterly charitable foundation report." Daniel nodded. Brooks Health Systems donated millions of dollars every year to shelters, community kitchens, mobile clinics, and emergency assistance programs. It was the part of the company he cared about most, or at least it had been. Lately, something felt wrong. The numbers looked perfect, almost too perfect. Every report praised efficiency. Every inspection claimed excellent conditions. Every audit declared success. Real life rarely looked that flawless, especially not in neighborhoods Daniel quietly visited whenever he wanted to escape boardrooms and cameras. He had seen food banks running short, homeless shelters turning people away, churches struggling to buy blankets. Yet official reports suggested everything was improving. The contradiction bothered him. He closed the folder. "I want to see it myself." Olivia sighed. We've discussed this. We have. And I still think it's dangerous. It isn't dangerous. You said that last time. Daniel leaned back. The only way to understand whether our programs actually help people is to stop arriving as the CEO. Olivia rubbed her forehead. So you're really doing this? I already decided. An hour later, Marcus Reed, head of corporate security, joined the meeting. He looked even less enthusiastic. Sir, no. You haven't heard me yet. I know exactly what you're going to say. Marcus folded his arms. I strongly advise against disappearing without security. I won't disappear. You literally plan to. Daniel almost laughed. I'll be 2 miles away. You'll be alone. That's the point. Marcus placed a folder on the desk. If the board finds out, the board won't. Silence settled between them. Finally, Marcus exhaled. You've already arranged everything, haven't you? Daniel nodded once. For nearly 6 months, he had quietly prepared. Simple clothes, a worn winter coat purchased from a thrift store, scuffed boots, a knit cap, an old backpack. Even his expensive watch would stay locked in his office. No assistants, no security detail following nearby, no cameras documenting generosity. He wanted strangers to see exactly what they would see if he possessed nothing. Only then could he learn how the city's most vulnerable people were truly treated. Late that afternoon, Daniel drove himself to a small storage garage several neighborhoods away. Inside waited an aging sedan registered under another company name. He changed clothes, removed his wedding-quality watch, took off his tailored coat, looked into a cracked mirror. The transformation surprised even him. Without expensive fabric-polished shoes and confident posture, he looked remarkably ordinary. Perhaps even forgettable. He slipped the walnut box into his backpack before hesitating. Then opened it one last time. His thumb brushed the blue button. A memory flickered. Not complete. Only fragments. Warm hands fastening a tiny blue sweater. A woman's soft laughter. The smell of cinnamon. Someone humming a lullaby whose melody disappeared before he could hear the ending. The images vanished as quickly as they came. Daniel closed the lid. I'll find you someday, he whispered to no one in particular. As darkness settled across Cleveland, he walked toward one of the neighborhoods served by several charities funded through Brooks Health Systems. His plan was simple. Spend the night unnoticed. Visit soup kitchens. Observe shelters. Talk with people without revealing his identity. Discover whether the company's promises reached the people they were supposed to serve. He had no idea that before another sunrise, hunger, exhaustion, and one elderly woman carrying her husband's folded dollar would forever change the purpose of his search. By late afternoon, Cleveland's winter sky had settled into a dull blanket of gray, swallowing what little sunlight January had offered. A bitter wind swept through Euclid Avenue, rattling bare tree branches and sending pedestrians hurrying toward heated buildings with their collars pulled high. Frances Hayes buttoned her worn wool coat to the top as she stepped out of the pharmacy. The small prescription bottle remained empty in her pocket. She had stood at the counter for nearly a minute after learning the refill would cost $28.63. She had smiled politely, apologized for taking up the pharmacist's time, and walked away carrying nothing but disappointment. Her fingers instinctively found the old leather wallet inside her coat. She opened it beneath the awning of the drugstore. 3 quarters, 2 dimes, 1 nickel, and Nathan's folded dollar. She gently unfolded it, smoothing the crease with her thumb exactly as she had done every morning for years. If you fold a dollar with hope, Nathan had always said, someday it'll come back carrying a blessing. Frances smiled sadly. I could use a little blessing tonight. She folded it once more and tucked it away. The walk home normally took 20 minutes, but the icy sidewalks forced everyone to move carefully. At 8:47 p.m., she stopped outside Linda Morales' neighborhood convenience store intending to spend the dollar on a carton of milk before heading back to her boarding house. Milk would at least allow her to make oatmeal for breakfast. She reached for the door handle. Then she heard it. A heavy thud against concrete. Several feet away, a man wearing a dirty gray coat collapsed face first onto the frozen sidewalk. A paper cup rolled from his hand, scattering a few coins into the slush. People noticed. No one stopped. A young couple glanced over before continuing toward a nearby parking garage. A man in business attire frowned briefly, then crossed the street. Someone muttered, "Probably drunk." Another shook his head. "Happens every winter." Within seconds, the sidewalk resumed its normal rhythm, flowing around the motionless figure, as though he were little more than another pile of dirty snow. Frances stood perfectly still. Her heart tightened, not from illness this time, but from something far older. Conscience. She hurried toward him, knees protesting with every step. "Sir." No answer. She knelt beside him, despite the freezing pavement soaking through her stockings. His skin looked pale beneath several days of unshaven beard. She gently touched his shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" Nothing. His breathing was shallow, not the heavy, uneven breathing of someone intoxicated. Different. Weak. She had seen something similar years earlier, while volunteering at church. Low blood sugar. She glanced around. "Can somebody help me?" People kept walking. One teenager removed an earbud. "Ma'am, don't touch him. He might be dangerous." Frances looked back at the unconscious stranger. "He isn't dangerous. He's sick." The teenager hesitated, then disappeared into the crowd. Frances slipped one hand beneath the man's neck to keep his airway open. His lips were dry. His hands trembled faintly, even while unconscious. She searched his coat for identification, hoping to call family, but found nothing except an old knit glove with a hole in one finger. No wallet, no phone, no clues. Only a man the city had stopped seeing. Sirens echoed somewhere several blocks away. Too far. She reached into her pocket for her cell phone. Then remembered. She had canceled the service months earlier to save money. Only emergency calls remained possible. Her old phone battery had died that morning anyway. She looked toward Linda Morales' convenience store. Food. He needed food quickly. Instinctively, her hand found the wallet again. She opened it. The folded dollar stared back at her. She looked toward the pharmacy across the street. $1 would not buy her medication, not tonight. But it could buy something small to raise this stranger's blood sugar until help arrived. For one brief moment, she closed her eyes. Her own chest had been hurting since noon. Without tomorrow's medicine, that pain might grow worse. Dr. Collins's warning echoed in her memory. "You cannot keep putting yourself last." Nathan's voice followed quietly behind it. "Hope keeps people alive." Frances took a slow breath. "I'm sorry, Nathan." "I know exactly what you'd tell me." She stood and hurried into the convenience store. The bell above the door jingled. Linda Morales looked up from stocking shelves. "Evening, Frances." "I need the cheapest loaf of bread you have." Linda pointed toward a rack. "And one small carton of milk." Linda scanned both items. $1.12. Frances emptied every coin from her pocket. 3 quarters, 2 dimes, 1 nickel. Then she carefully unfolded the last dollar. Linda immediately noticed. "Frances." "It's all right. I'll manage." Linda quietly looked at the register. Without saying another word, she removed 12 cents from the total. $1 exactly. Frances frowned. "You don't have to." "I know. But I'd like to." Their eyes met for only a second. No speeches, no embarrassment. Just 2 women protecting each other's dignity. Frances smiled softly. "Thank you." She hurried back outside, carrying the milk and bread. The man remained where she had left him. She knelt again, tore off a small piece of bread, soaked it lightly with milk, and gently touched it against his lips. Come on. Just a little. At first there was no response. Then a faint swallow, another. His eyelids fluttered briefly before closing again. Encouraged, she repeated the process patiently. Tiny bites, tiny sips, enough to begin waking his body. Finally, his breathing grew steadier. His fingers twitched. His eyes opened only halfway. Everything appeared blurred. The first face Daniel Brooks saw that night was not a doctor, not a security guard, not an executive assistant. It was an elderly woman with silver hair escaping beneath a knitted hat, kneeling on freezing concrete while holding a carton of milk with hands reddened by winter. "You'll be all right," she whispered. "You just stay with me." Daniel tried to speak. Only one weak word escaped. "Why?" Frances smiled. "Because somebody should." She looked around desperately. "Can anyone call an ambulance?" This time an older taxi driver stopped. "I already did. They're 2 minutes away." Relief washed over Frances. She kept talking quietly to the stranger, not because he seemed fully awake, but because lonely people deserved familiar voices. "My name's Frances. You don't need to answer. Just keep breathing." Daniel struggled to focus. Her voice stirred something buried impossibly deep inside him. Not recognition, not memory. Only an unexpected feeling of safety he had not experienced since childhood. Within moments, flashing red and blue lights reflected across the icy street. Paramedics rushed toward them carrying medical bags. As they lifted Daniel onto the stretcher, one of them turned to Frances. "Ma'am, are you family?" She looked at the unconscious man for a long second, then quietly shook her head. "No. I'm just someone who happened to stop." Without waiting for thanks, she picked up her empty wallet, buttoned her old coat against the wind, and slowly began the lonely walk back to her boarding house, never imagining that the man she had just saved would spend the following morning searching for the woman who had given away her very last dollar. The ambulance doors closed with a hollow metallic thud, and within seconds the flashing lights disappeared into the winter traffic. Frances Hayes stood alone on the sidewalk, the empty milk carton still clutched in one hand. Snow had begun to fall again, light enough to look almost gentle beneath the streetlights. Tiny flakes settled across her silver hair before melting against the warmth of her forehead. Only then did she realize how tired she felt. The rush of helping a stranger had pushed her own pain into the background, but now the dull pressure beneath her breastbone returned with quiet determination. She pressed one gloved hand against her chest. "Not tonight," she whispered. "Please, not tonight." The boarding house was still nearly 20 minutes away. Each block felt longer than the last. She stopped twice to catch her breath, pretending to admire store windows whenever someone passed. Pride had become another survival skill. She had learned long ago that many people felt uncomfortable around visible suffering. If she rested without explanation, strangers asked questions. If she pretended everything was fine, they simply kept walking. By the time she climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, it was nearly 10 o'clock. Mrs. Eleanor Bishop, the landlady, opened her apartment door after hearing the familiar footsteps. "You look pale, Frances." "I'm just tired." "You sure?" Frances forced a smile. "I've had harder days." Eleanor studied her for another moment. "You need anything?" "No. I've got enough." It was technically true. She had a roof, a blanket, running water. Many people had less. Inside her room, she removed her damp coat and carefully hung it beside the door. The old wallet felt strangely lighter. Not because it weighed less, because for the first time in over 20 years, Nathan's folded dollar was gone. She opened the wallet anyway. An empty space greeted her where the bill had rested for so many mornings. Instead of sadness, An unexpected peace settled over her. "I hope he makes it," she said softly into the quiet room. She never wondered whether the man would remember her. That had never been the point. She filled a kettle, made another cup of chicory coffee, and toasted the final slice of bread she had left from earlier in the week. Dinner consisted of dry toast and warm water. It was enough. Before going to bed, she opened the small wooden box that sat on her bookshelf. Inside were a few treasures that would have looked worthless to almost anyone else. Nathan's wedding band, a tiny knitted blue mitten barely large enough for a 4-year-old child, and a newspaper clipping dated January 19th, 1989. The headline had faded almost beyond recognition. Apartment fire. Claims multiple victims. Frances traced the edge of the clipping. "They never found you," she whispered. "So I never stopped hoping." She gently returned everything to the box before switching off the lamp. Outside snow continued falling across Cleveland. At 6:12 the next morning, her alarm sounded. Frances woke immediately, though she had slept poorly. The tightness in her chest had not disappeared. Her prescription bottle sat on the kitchen counter. Empty. She poured herself hot water instead. After dressing, she slipped on her blue volunteer apron beneath her winter coat and began walking toward St. Matthew's Community Church. The sidewalk sparkled beneath fresh snow. Several regular volunteers were already unloading donated bread when she arrived. Pastor Samuel Carter looked up with his usual warm smile. "Morning, Frances." "Morning." "You all right?" "I'll survive." "You always say that." "So far, I've always been right." He chuckled. "You've got me there." Breakfast service began promptly at 7. The dining hall slowly filled with familiar faces. Walter, Maria, old Henry, a young veteran named Chris who always asked for extra oatmeal. Frances greeted each one by name. She believed people deserved to be recognized before they were helped. Names mattered. Near the end of breakfast, while carrying a tray of coffee cups toward the kitchen, a wave of dizziness washed over her. She stopped. The room tilted slightly. Emma Foster, one of the volunteer nurses, immediately noticed. "Frances, I'm fine." "You don't look fine." "I'm just a little lightheaded." Emma gently took the tray from her hands. "When did you last eat?" "This morning." "What?" "Half a piece of toast." Emma frowned. "And your medication?" Frances hesitated a second too long. "You skipped it again?" "I couldn't refill it yet." Emma sighed quietly. "Come sit down. I'm needed here." "You're needed alive." Frances smiled apologetically. "I'll sit after we finish serving." She took one more step, then another. The hallway blurred. The coffee cups slipped from her fingers. Porcelain shattered across the floor. Several volunteers turned at once. Frances tried to apologize. "I'm sorry." The words never fully formed. Her knees buckled beneath her. Pastor Samuel reached her just before she struck the floor. "Call 911 inches." Emma knelt immediately beside her. "Frances, can you hear me?" Frances opened her eyes weakly. "I'm all right." "No, you're not." Emma checked her pulse. Fast. Irregular. "When was your last heart pill?" Frances closed her eyes. "Yesterday morning." Emma exchanged a worried glance with Pastor Samuel. "She's going to the hospital." Across the city, almost at that exact moment, Daniel Brooks slowly regained consciousness beneath bright emergency room lights. A cardiac monitor beeped steadily beside him. His head felt heavy, his throat dry. Dr. Rebecca Collins stood nearby reviewing his chart. "Welcome back." Daniel blinked. "What happened?" "You experienced severe hypoglycemia combined with exhaustion and dehydration." Pieces of memory returned slowly. The freezing sidewalk, darkness. Then, an elderly woman, Silver hair, kind eyes, a carton of milk. He looked around the room. Where is she? Dr. Collins frowned. Who? The woman who helped me. The paramedics said she left before they arrived. Daniel pushed himself upright, despite the doctor's protest. Did anyone get her name? They mentioned she said her name was Frances. Frances? He repeated it quietly, as though testing a word he had somehow known before. He looked toward the chair where Marcus Reed now sat, clearly relieved to see him awake. Marcus stood immediately. You scared everyone. Daniel ignored the comment. I need security footage. Marcus blinked. From where? The convenience store. The street. The ambulance. I want to find her. Marcus hesitated. Sir, you should rest. Daniel shook his head. She gave me something she couldn't afford. How do you know? I could see it. There was nothing in her wallet after she bought that milk. He remembered her careful movements, the way she had unfolded a single dollar as though it carried enormous meaning, the tenderness with which she spoke to a complete stranger. No hesitation, no expectation, no audience, only compassion. Daniel looked out the hospital window as snow continued falling across Cleveland. Somewhere in that vast city, the woman who had saved his life was facing another ordinary morning. Neither of them knew that before sunset, the search for a simple act of kindness would begin, uncovering a truth buried for nearly 4 decades. Daniel Brooks left the hospital against his doctor's recommendation before noon. Dr. Rebecca Collins had insisted he remain under observation for another 24 hours, but Daniel promised to rest at home instead. They both knew he rarely broke promises, yet they also knew he rarely abandoned an unanswered question. This question mattered more than any board meeting waiting on his calendar. Marcus Reed drove while Daniel sat quietly in the back seat, replaying the previous night over and over. He remembered the freezing sidewalk, the taste of milk, the gentle voice. Most of all, he remembered the way the elderly woman had looked at him. Not with pity, not with suspicion, simply with concern, as though helping another human being required no explanation. Marcus glanced into the rearview mirror. You've been silent for 20 minutes. I'm thinking. I can tell. Daniel looked toward the passing streets. Did we get the footage? Marcus handed him a tablet. The convenience store owner cooperated immediately. Security cameras recorded everything from 3 different angles. Daniel watched in silence. There he was, collapsing onto the sidewalk. People stepping around him. A businessman checking his watch before walking away. 2 teenagers laughing nervously as they crossed the street. A woman pulling her child farther away. Then, 32 seconds later, Frances entered the frame. She stopped instantly, knelt beside him without hesitation, checked his breathing, looked around for help. Daniel leaned forward. Pause. Marcus stopped the video. The screen showed Frances opening her old wallet. She carefully unfolded a single dollar. Daniel stared. Even through the grainy security footage, he could see how deliberately she handled the bill. Not casually, almost reverently. Keep playing. The next camera showed her entering the convenience store. Moments later, she returned carrying bread and milk. She fed him tiny pieces with remarkable patience. She stayed beside him until paramedics arrived, then quietly walked away before anyone could even ask her name. No performance, no expectation of recognition. Daniel closed the tablet. Find her. Marcus nodded. We're already trying. Their first stop was Linda Morales's convenience store. The bell above the entrance rang as Daniel stepped inside, wearing ordinary clothes instead of his business suit. Linda looked up from arranging canned soup. Can I help you? Marcus spoke first. We're looking for the woman who helped someone outside last night. Recognition immediately crossed Linda's face. Frances. Daniel smiled faintly. You know her. Everybody around here knows Frances Hayes. Linda rested both hands on the counter. She's the kind of person who remembers birthdays nobody else remembers. Daniel listened quietly. Do you know where she lives? I do. Linda hesitated. But before I tell you, she looked directly at Daniel. Promise me something. What? Don't embarrass her. Daniel frowned slightly. I don't understand. Linda sighed. People sometimes hear stories like this and show up waving cameras or writing giant checks because it makes them feel generous. Frances hates being treated like charity. Daniel answered immediately. I'm not bringing cameras. I only want to thank her. Linda studied his face for several seconds. Apparently satisfied, she nodded. She rents a room at Mrs. Bishop's boarding house on Maple Street. Then she smiled sadly. I wish she'd let people help more. Daniel glanced toward the bread shelf. Tell me about last night. Linda looked out the front window. I've known Frances nearly 12 years. She always pays exactly what she owes. Never asks for credit. Never complains. She paused. When she came in yesterday, I knew something was different. Why? Because she unfolded the last dollar she'd been carrying for years. Daniel's eyes narrowed. The last dollar? Linda nodded. Her late husband folded it before he died. She told me he believed hope lived inside that dollar. Daniel remained silent. I charged her $1, even though the food cost more. She almost argued. Then she thanked me like I'd given her the world. Linda shook her head gently. She bought food for you instead of medicine? Daniel looked up. What medicine? Heart medication. She couldn't afford the refill. The words landed with crushing weight. Daniel slowly lowered his gaze. So she gave away the money she needed to stay healthy. Linda nodded once. That's exactly what she did. Neither man spoke for several moments. Outside snow drifted softly across the parking lot. Finally, Daniel asked quietly, What kind of person does something like that? Linda answered without hesitation. The kind who never asks whether someone deserves kindness. An hour later, the black SUV stopped half a block away from Maple Street. Daniel had specifically instructed Marcus not to park directly in front of the boarding house. I don't want to frighten her. Mrs. Eleanor Bishop answered the front door. She eyed the expensive vehicle suspiciously. Can I help you, gentlemen? Daniel introduced himself only as Daniel. I'm looking for Frances Hayes. Eleanor smiled politely. She's not home. Is she at church? No. Hospital. Daniel's expression changed immediately. What happened? Mrs. Bishop explained how Frances had collapsed while volunteering that morning. Emma Foster insisted on calling an ambulance. She's stable, I hope. I haven't heard otherwise. Daniel exhaled slowly. The realization hit harder than expected. She had nearly sacrificed her own health to save his. Marcus quietly stepped aside, giving Daniel a moment. Mrs. Bishop noticed. You know Frances? Not well enough. Daniel answered honestly. I'm hoping to. Before leaving, Eleanor added one more sentence. If you're planning to help her, Daniel looked back. Don't insult her pride. She's stronger than she looks. Instead of driving immediately to the hospital, Daniel asked Marcus to stop several streets away. He wanted to walk. Fresh snow covered the sidewalks. Children laughed while building a crooked snowman. An elderly man struggled to shovel his driveway. Without thinking, Daniel stepped forward and took the shovel. The old man looked surprised. You don't have to. Daniel smiled. I know. But I can. The words sounded strangely familiar. He froze. He had heard them somewhere. Not recently. Long ago. The memory disappeared before he could grasp it. Marcus watched quietly from across the street. Something about Daniel had already begun changing. Helping strangers no longer felt like a corporate responsibility. It felt personal. As they continued walking, Daniel noticed a small church food pantry distributing winter coats. Volunteers greeted each visitor by name. Children ran between folding tables. Neighbors shared coffee despite the freezing wind. This was where real generosity lived, he realized. Not inside annual reports, inside ordinary people who kept showing up. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and found the walnut box. He opened it briefly. The burned photograph. The blue button. For reasons he could not explain, Francis's gentle smile from the previous night blended effortlessly with the blurred face in the damaged picture. Impossible. Coincidence. Nothing more. Yet the feeling refused to leave. He closed the box and looked toward the distant hospital rising above the Cleveland skyline. Somewhere inside that building rested the woman who had unknowingly become the first person in decades to awaken memories he had believed were gone forever. Frances Hayes expected the hospital to discharge her before lunch. After several hours of observation, Dr. Rebecca Collins reviewed the latest test results with a relieved smile. "Your heart wasn't damaged." Frances released a slow breath. "That's good news." "It is. But this was a warning." Dr. Collins folded her clipboard. "You collapsed because you skipped medication, barely ate, and kept pushing yourself." "I know. You have to start taking care of yourself." Frances looked towards the window, where snow continued drifting across Cleveland. "I've spent 40 years taking care of other people. I suppose I forgot how to change habits." The doctor smiled sympathetically. "Then let's start with one." She handed Frances a small paper bag. "I spoke with the hospital assistance program. Your medication is covered for the next 3 months." Frances stared at the bag without touching it. "I can't accept charity." Dr. Collins gently shook her head. "It isn't charity. It's exactly why the program exists." After a long silence, Frances finally accepted it. "Thank you. You've probably helped more strangers than you'll ever know." "It's all right if someone helps you once." An hour later, Frances stepped out of the hospital carrying nothing more than her medication, her old purse, and a knitted scarf. She intended to catch the city bus home. Instead, she noticed a man standing near the entrance. He wore a dark winter coat instead of an expensive suit. No security surrounded him. No reporters. He simply waited with both hands inside his pockets. The moment Daniel Brooks saw her emerge through the automatic doors, he recognized her instantly. The silver hair, the gentle posture, the same calm eyes that had looked down at him on the frozen sidewalk. He walked toward her. "Mrs. Hayes?" Frances looked up. "Yes, my name is Daniel." For a brief second, neither spoke. Daniel suddenly realized he had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times during the drive to the hospital. Every prepared sentence vanished. Finally, he smiled. "I believe we met last night." Recognition slowly appeared on Frances's face. "The young man outside Linda's store." "That's right." She immediately searched his face. "You look much better." "I feel much better." "I'm glad." There was no dramatic reaction. No surprise that he had come looking. She simply seemed relieved he had recovered. Daniel held out his hand. "You saved my life." She shook her head gently. "I helped. There's a difference. It doesn't feel different to me." Daniel laughed quietly. "You really are exactly the person everyone described." She looked confused. "You've been asking about me?" "I wanted the chance to say thank you." He reached into his coat pocket and removed an envelope. "I know you gave up something important to help me. I'd like you to accept this." Frances didn't even open it. "I can't. It's only money." "Exactly." She carefully placed the envelope back into his hand. I didn't help you because I expected to be paid. I know. Then please don't turn kindness into a transaction. Daniel looked at the envelope for a long moment before slipping it back into his pocket. He wasn't offended. He was humbled. Almost everyone accepted money. Frances had refused it without even checking the amount. Instead, she asked the question he least expected. Did the doctors find out why you collapsed? Daniel blinked. Low blood sugar. You've been skipping meals. It wasn't a question. He smiled sheepishly. Sometimes. She folded her arms. Don't do that. People with responsibilities think they can ignore their bodies. Eventually, the body stops cooperating. Daniel couldn't help smiling. You sound like my doctor. I've had enough experience with stubborn patients. For the first time in many years, he laughed without restraint. The sound surprised both of them. A nearby cafe stood across the street from the hospital. Daniel glanced toward it. May I buy you breakfast? You've already missed yours because of me. Frances hesitated. I don't want you spending unnecessary money. It's breakfast, she smiled. I suppose breakfast isn't unnecessary. The little diner had served Cleveland for nearly 50 years. Red vinyl booths lined the windows. The smell of fresh pancakes filled the room. A waitress named Carol greeted Frances immediately. Good to see you back. You gave us a scare. I'm harder to get rid of than people think. Carol laughed before pouring 2 cups of coffee. Daniel watched quietly. Every employee seemed genuinely happy to see Frances. Not because she was famous, because she belonged. After ordering oatmeal for herself and scrambled eggs for Daniel, Frances waited until the waitress walked away. You really should eat more often. I've heard that twice today. Then perhaps you should listen. Daniel nodded obediently. Yes, ma'am. Frances chuckled. Good. As breakfast arrived, conversation drifted naturally. Daniel learned she had worked in an elementary school cafeteria for 31 years. She learned he managed a healthcare technology company. He deliberately avoided mentioning that he owned it. To her, he was simply someone with an important job. What made you volunteer after retiring? He asked. Frances stirred her oatmeal thoughtfully. When you've known hunger, she paused. It's difficult to walk past someone else's. Daniel listened without interrupting. My husband believed kindness grows only when it's given away. He used to say people become poor twice. First in their pockets, then in their hearts. She smiled at the memory. I promised him I'd never let the second one happen. Daniel lowered his eyes. My parents believed something similar. You were close. Very. They adopted me. Frances looked up gently. They must have loved you very much. They did. She nodded with quiet certainty. You can always tell. Children who are truly loved never stop looking for ways to love others. The sentence settled over the table with unexpected weight. Daniel felt something tighten inside his chest. Not pain, recognition. Again, that strange feeling. As though sitting across from this woman felt strangely familiar. He watched the way she broke her toast into neat little pieces before eating. The way she wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. The soft humming that escaped almost unconsciously as she looked out the diner window. A melody, only 3 or 4 notes. Yet something inside him stirred. A distant echo from childhood. He frowned slightly. Do you always hum that tune? Frances looked surprised. I suppose I do. Nathan loved hearing it. My mother used to sing it before... Her voice faded. Before what? Before we lost our little boy. Silence settled between them. I'm sorry, Daniel said softly. It was a long time ago. That doesn't make it hurt less. She smiled sadly. It only teaches you how to carry the hurt. Daniel found himself unable to look away from her. There was extraordinary strength hidden beneath her gentle voice. Strength without bitterness, without resentment. As they finished breakfast, neither realized that each small conversation, each familiar gesture, each forgotten melody was quietly leading two separated lives toward a truth neither of them yet dared imagine. The breakfast dishes had long been cleared away, yet Daniel Brooks found himself lingering outside the little diner. Frances stood beside the bus stop, adjusting the knitted scarf around her neck, while waiting for Route 32 to arrive. Snowflakes drifted lazily between them, softening the noise of the city. "You don't have to wait with me," she said. "I don't mind. I know you're busy." Daniel smiled. "For once, I'm exactly where I want to be." She looked at him with quiet amusement. "You remind me of someone." "Oh, my husband. He always insisted he had nowhere more important to be than wherever he already was." Daniel laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is." The bus rounded the corner in the distance, but before it reached the stop, Frances suddenly bent to retrieve something that had slipped from her coat pocket. A small, worn envelope fell onto the snowy sidewalk. As she picked it up, another item fluttered free, a blackened piece of an old photograph. The wind carried it several feet before Daniel instinctively caught it. "I'm sorry," Frances said quickly. "My fingers aren't what they used to be." Daniel looked down. The photograph showed the smiling face of a young woman holding a little boy whose body had been mostly destroyed by fire damage. Only part of the child's blue sweater remained visible. The right edge of the photograph was jagged, as though another piece had once been attached. An unexpected chill passed through him. His heartbeat quickened. "Mrs. Hayes." Frances noticed his expression. "Is something wrong?" He handed the photograph back carefully. "No. I just—" His voice faded. "It looks very old." She gently brushed melting snow from the damaged paper before placing it back inside the envelope. "It survived the apartment fire. My husband found this piece weeks later. It was all we ever recovered." Daniel swallowed. "What happened?" Frances stared toward the approaching bus, but seemed to be looking decades into the past instead. "It was January. Cold. Much colder than today. Our apartment building caught fire during the night." She spoke calmly now, not because the pain had disappeared, but because grief repeated often enough eventually learned to whisper instead of scream. "My husband got me out. He went back inside looking for our son." Her fingers tightened around the envelope. The firefighters found Nathan. They never found Benjamin." Daniel felt his chest tighten. "Benjamin. Our little boy. He was 4. For a split second, a strange image flashed through Daniel's mind. Smoke. Orange light. Someone shouting. Strong arms lifting him. A woman crying his name. The memory vanished before he could hold on to it. "You all right?" Frances asked. He blinked. "Just dizzy for a second." The bus pulled up with a hiss of compressed air. Frances reached for the handrail. Daniel spoke before thinking. "May I see that photograph again sometime?" She looked surprised. "It isn't much to look at." "I know. I'd still like to." She smiled kindly. "Perhaps." The doors closed. Daniel watched the bus disappear down the snowy street. He remained standing long after it had gone. 20 minutes later, he unlocked the walnut box in his office. Marcus Reed entered without knocking. "You skipped the board meeting. It can wait." Daniel carefully removed the burned photograph he had carried for decades. His hand suddenly felt unsteady. He placed it on the desk, then opened his phone. During breakfast, without Frances noticing, he had quietly taken a picture of the damaged photograph she carried. Now he enlarged both images side by side. Marcus frowned. "What are we looking at?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he slowly rotated the digital image until the burned edges matched the angle of his own photograph. His breathing stopped. The torn edges looked close, not perfectly aligned, but astonishingly similar. The same burn pattern, the same missing corner, the same discoloration caused by smoke. Marcus leaned closer. That can't be coincidence. I don't know. Daniel whispered the words more to himself than anyone else. I don't know. He reached into the walnut box again. The blue button rested beside the photograph. Without warning, another memory surfaced. Tiny fingers buttoning a blue sweater, a woman laughing. You never stay still long enough for me to finish. Then darkness, smoke, someone shouting. Ben! Daniel's eyes widened. Marcus immediately noticed. What happened? I heard a name. What name? Daniel stared at the photographs. Ben. Silence filled the office. Marcus carefully chose his next words. You've told me before your childhood memories sometimes return in fragments. They've never been this clear. He rubbed his temples. It felt real. Marcus folded his arms. What are you thinking? Daniel looked again at the matching edges. He stopped. The possibility sounded impossible even inside his own head. If these photographs belonged to the same picture, Marcus finished the sentence quietly, then she could have known your family. Daniel nodded slowly. Or, neither man spoke the alternative aloud, because saying it made it feel too dangerous, too hopeful, too cruel, if wrong. Meanwhile, across the city, Frances returned to her boarding house. Mrs. Eleanor Bishop waited in the hallway. You've got company. Frances looked surprised. I do. No. The gentleman left about 20 minutes ago. He didn't want to disturb you. Mrs. Bishop handed her a small paper bag. He dropped this off. Inside were fresh oranges, whole-grain bread oatmeal, and low-sodium soup. Nothing extravagant, only groceries carefully chosen for someone with heart problems. There was no money, no business card, no expensive gift, only a handwritten note. Thank you for reminding me that kindness doesn't ask who someone is before it decides to help. Daniel Francis smiled softly. He listens. What? Mrs. Bishop asked. He listens? That's rarer than generosity. She carefully placed the note inside the same envelope that held Nathan's photograph. For reasons she couldn't explain, she wanted to keep them together. Late that evening, Daniel called Olivia Grant into his office. She immediately noticed the photographs spread across the desk. I've never seen you look like this. I need every record connected to the apartment fire where I was found. Everything. Fire department reports. Adoption files. Hospital admissions. Witness statements. No matter how small. Olivia nodded. I'll start tonight. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. And don't tell anyone why. She studied him carefully. You think you found something. I think. He looked once more at the nearly matching photographs. For the first time in 41 years, I may finally be asking the right questions. Outside the office windows, snow continued falling across Cleveland, quietly covering old streets that had witnessed a tragedy nearly 4 decades earlier. Beneath that blanket of white, forgotten memories were beginning to find their way back to the surface. 3 days passed, but Daniel Brooks found it impossible to think about quarterly profits, expansion plans, or investor presentations. Every free moment returned him to the same question. Who was Frances Hayes? Olivia Grant transformed an unused conference room into a temporary archive center. Old city maps covered one wall. Fire department records filled several boxes. Digital copies of adoption files flickered across computer screens. Marcus Reed coordinated requests from city agencies, while private investigators searched forgotten databases that had not been accessed in decades. The deeper they looked, the stranger everything became. Late Friday afternoon, Olivia entered Daniel's office carrying another folder. "I found something." Daniel immediately set aside the financial report he had been pretending to read. "What is it?" "A witness statement." She laid a yellowed document on his desk. "The apartment fire." He scanned the first paragraph. The report described smoke conditions, evacuation procedures, and firefighter observations. Nothing unusual. Then his eyes reached the final page. Witness number 4, Margaret Ellis. Resident, apartment 3, B, statement. "I saw Mrs. Frances Hayes screaming that her little boy was missing. Firefighters pulled her husband back because he kept trying to run inside again. Later I saw another firefighter carrying a small child toward an ambulance, but I never learned what happened afterward because police moved everyone away." Daniel looked up sharply. "I thought they said no child had been recovered." "They did," Olivia nodded. "But this witness believed she saw one." "Could she have been mistaken?" "Possibly. But there are more inconsistencies." She handed him another document. Hospital intake records from that same night. An unidentified 4-year-old boy had been admitted briefly for smoke inhalation before being transferred to Child Protective Services because no relatives could be identified. Daniel's pulse quickened. The admission time matched almost perfectly with the apartment fire. Name: unknown. Personal belongings. Olivia pointed to the handwritten inventory. One blue plastic shirt button, half-burned family photograph. Daniel closed his eyes. The room suddenly felt silent. Those were the exact keepsakes stored in his walnut box. Marcus, who had entered moments earlier, spoke quietly. "So, the belongings really did come from the fire." Daniel nodded slowly. "They always told me authorities believed my family died." Olivia looked down. "That's what everyone believed." "The records suggest something else happened," she continued explaining. "During the confusion of the evacuation, emergency workers believed all missing residents had already been accounted for. When the unidentified child recovered enough to speak, he remembered only his first name. Ben. Nothing else. Trauma specialists believed memory loss caused by shock explained the missing details. Several weeks later, after repeated searches failed to identify surviving relatives, the adoption process began. Daniel stared through the office window. "I wasn't abandoned." "No," Marcus answered quietly. "You were lost." That evening, Daniel visited St. Matthew's Community Church, not because he expected answers, because it was where Frances felt most at home. The dining hall had emptied after dinner service. Pastor Samuel Carter stacked folding chairs while humming softly. Daniel introduced himself. "I'm looking for Frances Hayes." The pastor smiled warmly. "You won't find a kinder woman." "I've already discovered that." Samuel set another chair against the wall. "What brings you here?" "I'd like to understand who she is." The pastor leaned thoughtfully against the table. "That's a much bigger question than you realize." He described 20 years of quiet service, how Frances remembered everyone's names, how she secretly paid utility bills whenever the church emergency fund allowed, how she visited nursing homes every Sunday afternoon because, in her words, forgotten people deserved company as much as medicine. "She never talks about herself," Samuel said. "Only about other people." Daniel hesitated. "Has she ever mentioned her son?" The pastor's smile faded gently. "Only a few times." "What did she say?" "That she never believed he intentionally left her." Samuel looked towards the stained glass windows. "Most people eventually accepted he had died. Frances never completely did. Every January 19th, she lights one candle. One. Yes. She says hope doesn't require proof." Daniel felt his throat tighten. The following afternoon, Frances sat beside the window of her small room, carefully mending a child's winter mitten that had been donated to the church. Needle, thread, tiny stitches. She worked slowly because arthritis stiffened her fingers during cold weather. Mrs. Eleanor Bishop knocked gently. "You have another visitor." Frances smiled. "If it's Daniel, tell him he doesn't need to keep bringing groceries." "It isn't him." Emma Foster stepped inside carrying tea. "I thought you might enjoy some company." They spent nearly an hour talking about ordinary things. The church, neighborhood children, recipes. Finally, Emma asked the question that had lingered for years. "Do you ever think about stopping the search?" Frances continued sewing. "I don't search the way I used to, but I leave a DNA sample updated every few years. I keep old records. I answer investigators when they call." She smiled sadly. "And every birthday," her voice softened. "I wonder what kind of man Benjamin might have become." Emma reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You know none of this was your fault." "I know. But mothers don't measure guilt the same way everyone else does." "What do you mean?" Frances looked toward Nathan's photograph. "If your child disappears, there's always one more thing you think you should have done." Across town, Daniel opened the audio file Olivia had recovered from an interview conducted 27 years earlier. A nonprofit organization had recorded parents who lost children in major disasters. Frances's voice filled the speakers, soft, steady, older than the recording's date should have sounded. "My husband always believed hope could survive almost anything." A pause. "If Benjamin is gone," another pause, "then loving him is still worthwhile." Her voice trembled slightly. "If he's alive somewhere, I pray someone teaches him kindness." Daniel froze. His eyes slowly filled with tears. No business victory, no award, no public recognition had ever affected him like a single sentence from a woman who had spoken decades earlier without knowing anyone would hear her again. He quietly replayed the recording. Then again, each time something inside him broke a little further. Marcus entered without speaking. He simply stood beside the desk. After several minutes, Daniel whispered, "I don't know why, but listening to her feels like coming home." Marcus looked at the folders covering every surface. "I think we're getting close." Daniel nodded. "So do I." He reached into the walnut box and picked up the folded edge of the burned photograph. For the first time in 41 years, he no longer felt as though he were chasing a ghost. He was following the trail of a mother's love that had never stopped waiting for her son to find his way back. Daniel Brooks barely slept. The audio recording of Frances's voice replayed in his mind throughout the night. "If he's alive somewhere, I pray someone teaches him kindness." Those words echoed through every quiet corner of his penthouse. At sunrise, he unlocked the walnut box once more. Inside lay the burned photograph, the blue plastic button, and the adoption bracelet he had worn as a child. For 41 years, they had been nothing more than unanswered questions. Now they had become evidence. At 8 o'clock, sharp Olivia Grant and Marcus Reed arrived with the final files. Neither looked rested. "We found the original Child Protective Services caseworker," Olivia said. "She's 91 now." "Still alive?" "Yes." "Margaret Sullivan." Daniel immediately stood. "I want to meet her." Margaret Sullivan lived in a modest assisted living community on the outskirts of Cleveland. Her memory had faded in places, but when Daniel introduced himself, her eyes immediately filled with recognition. "The little boy." Daniel froze. "You remember me?" "I remember all my difficult cases." She smiled gently. "You hardly spoke for months." Margaret slowly opened an old storage box she had kept despite retirement decades earlier. I wasn't supposed to keep copies. But sometimes paperwork carries pieces of people's lives. Inside rested yellow folders tied with faded ribbon. She carefully untied one. Across the front was written, "Unknown male child. Temporary name Ben." Daniel's hands trembled. Margaret adjusted her glasses. "You repeated only 3 things. What were they?" "Mama. Blue blanket. And..." She closed her eyes, searching her memory. "A song." Daniel looked at her without breathing. "What song?" "I don't remember all the words." "But you hummed it constantly." She slowly tapped her fingers against the armrest, then softly sang 4 simple notes. Daniel's entire body stiffened. The melody. Exactly the melody Francis had unconsciously hummed in the diner. Not similar. Identical. He closed his eyes. Without warning, another fragment burst into his mind. A tiny bedroom. Blue curtains. A woman's warm voice singing while buttoning his sweater. Strong arms lifting him afterward. A man's laughter. Then smoke. Fire. Someone shouting his name. Benjamin Daniel inhaled sharply. Marcus reached toward him. "You okay?" Daniel nodded, unable to speak. Margaret watched him with kind eyes. "The memories are coming back." "They're not complete." "They don't have to be." She gently placed a wrinkled hand over his. "Trauma buries memories. Love often uncovers them." Before leaving, Margaret handed Daniel one final envelope. This was never claimed. Inside rested a tiny hospital wristband, Patient Benjamin Hayes. Daniel stared at the printed name. Not Ben, not unknown male. Benjamin Hayes. The room disappeared around him. 41 years believing he had no past. 41 years while one simple wristband waited inside an old envelope. Olivia quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Marcus looked away, giving Daniel privacy. Daniel whispered the name aloud. Benjamin. For the first time in his adult life, it sounded like his own. That afternoon, Daniel requested a confidential DNA comparison. Dr. Rebecca Collins personally supervised the process. Frances had voluntarily updated her DNA profile years earlier through the National Missing Persons Registry. Daniel's adoption records already contained preserved biological samples collected during childhood. The laboratory promised preliminary results within 24 hours. Waiting felt impossible. To distract himself, Daniel drove alone through Cleveland. Without security, without an agenda. Eventually, he found himself outside St. Matthew's Church. Inside, Frances was arranging donated books for neighborhood children. She looked up and smiled. "Daniel, you've become a regular visitor. I hope I'm not bothering you." "You haven't yet." He helped carry another box onto the shelves. Neither mentioned investigations. Neither mentioned photographs. They simply worked side by side. After several quiet minutes, Frances began humming. The same lullaby. Daniel paused. This time the melody continued longer. He recognized another phrase. Without thinking, he softly hummed the next notes. Frances stopped arranging books. Her eyes widened. "You know that song?" Daniel looked surprised himself. I don't know how. It just came naturally." She studied him carefully. "My mother taught it to me." "I used to sing it for Benjamin every night." Daniel felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. He looked away. "I've heard it somewhere. I wish I remembered where." Frances smiled gently. "Perhaps someone once loved you enough to sing it too." The simple sentence nearly broke him. If she only knew. That evening, the church hosted its weekly community dinner. Daniel volunteered quietly. He served soup, washed dishes, refilled coffee. No one recognized the billionaire CEO beneath the simple apron. An elderly veteran named Walter patted Daniel's shoulder. You've got Francis working beside you. You're learning from the best. Daniel smiled. I believe I am. He watched Francis move through the room. She greeted every guest by name. She noticed when one child seemed unusually quiet and slipped an extra apple into his backpack. She sat beside a lonely widow for 15 minutes, even though the kitchen still needed cleaning. Every act appeared effortless, natural, as though kindness was simply the language she spoke. Daniel suddenly realized something. Every quality people admired in him as a leader's listening, patience, compassion, protecting employees, funding hospitals. None of those qualities had appeared from nowhere. Perhaps they had been planted before memory itself disappeared. Perhaps a mother's love could survive even when memory could not. Late that night, Daniel returned home. His phone remained beside him every second. At 11:47 p.m. it rang. Dr. Rebecca Collins. He answered immediately. Doctor, the preliminary DNA analysis is complete. Silence filled the line. Daniel could hear only his own heartbeat. The comparison shows an extremely high probability of a biological relationship. He closed his eyes. How high? Over 99.99%. His knees nearly gave way. The laboratory is completing confirmatory testing tomorrow morning. She paused. But professionally, I have never seen a result this clear. Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter, unable to speak, unable to breathe. Tears finally came without resistance. Not because he had discovered he was Benjamin Hayes. Deep inside, he had already begun believing that. He cried because somewhere across the city an elderly woman had spent 41 birthdays wondering whether her little boy was alive. And tomorrow she would finally learn that every candle she had lit in hope had never been burning for nothing. The final DNA report arrived at 8:03 the next morning. Daniel Brooks stared at the sealed envelope for nearly 5 minutes before opening it. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without hesitation. He had spoken before Congress. He had faced hostile investors and impossible deadlines. Yet a single sheet of paper left his hands trembling. He unfolded the report. Confirmed biological relationship parent-child. Probability of maternity 99.999999%. For a long time he simply sat in silence. There was no triumph, no dramatic celebration. Only 41 years of unanswered questions quietly settling into place. Marcus Reed finally spoke. It's real. Daniel nodded. My mother, his voice broke, never stopped looking for me. Olivia wiped away tears. And you never stopped looking for her. Daniel looked out across the city. Let's go. Frances Hayes spent Saturday morning exactly as she always did. She helped children choose books at the church reading corner. She repaired a torn backpack zipper for one little boy. She reminded another girl to wear gloves before going outside. Nothing about the morning suggested her life was about to change forever. Pastor Samuel walked over, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. You've been smiling more lately. Have I? I think your new friend has something to do with it. Frances laughed softly. Daniel, he's a good young man. I think life has made him lonelier than he admits. Pastor Samuel nodded. I noticed that too. He watches people before speaking. People who've lost something important often do. Before Frances could answer, the church doors opened. Daniel stepped inside. He wasn't wearing an expensive overcoat today, only the same simple winter jacket she had seen several times before. He held no flowers, no gifts, no cameras followed him. Only Marcus remained several steps behind before quietly stopping near the entrance to give them privacy. Frances smiled. Good morning. Daniel smiled back, though his eyes were noticeably red. I was hoping we could talk. Of course. She led him into the small chapel beside the main hall. Sunlight filtered gently through stained glass windows, painting soft colors across the wooden pews. Neither spoke immediately. Daniel looked at the cross near the altar before turning back toward her. "I received some answers." Frances tilted her head. "Answers? About my childhood." She listened patiently. "You once told me your son disappeared during the apartment fire." Her expression softened. "Yes." "You said his name was Benjamin." "That's right." Daniel slowly reached into his coat pocket. He removed the tiny blue plastic button. "I've carried this my entire life." Frances looked at it politely, then froze. Her breathing stopped. Her hands began shaking. She reached forward but didn't quite touch it. Her voice barely existed. "Where did you get this?" "It was found with me." She looked up sharply. "With you?" Daniel swallowed. "I don't remember everything. But I remember pieces now." He reached into another pocket. This time he unfolded the burned photograph, the half she had never seen. He placed it gently beside hers. The torn edges fit together almost perfectly. One complete picture. Nathan, young Francis, little Benjamin. No one moved. No one breathed. Frances stared at the reunited photograph. Her fingers slowly covered her mouth. "No." The whisper carried decades of hope and fear together. "No." Daniel's own eyes filled. "The DNA test confirmed it yesterday." She looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. Really seeing him. Her gaze traveled across his face, his eyes, the shape of his smile, then upward to the faint scar near his hairline. The scar. She remembered. Benjamin had fallen from his bicycle when he was 3. Nathan had rushed him to the emergency room. 2 stitches. A tiny crescent-shaped mark. Her knees weakened. Daniel stepped forward instinctively. She reached out with trembling hands. Not touching, just hovering beside his face, as though afraid he might disappear if she moved too quickly. "My little boy." The words escaped before she realized she had spoken them. Daniel closed his eyes. Nobody had ever called him that. Not once. Not in 41 years. Slowly, carefully, he placed his hands over hers. "I tried to remember. I'm sorry it took so long." Frances shook her head violently. "No. No. You have nothing to apologize for." Tears streamed freely down her cheeks. "You survived. That's all that ever mattered." Daniel could no longer hold back. He wrapped his arms around her. For a long moment, neither spoke. The chapel remained completely silent except for quiet sobs. Pastor Samuel stood outside the doorway. He had witnessed enough to understand. Without interrupting, he quietly closed the chapel doors, giving mother and son the privacy 41 stolen years deserved. Eventually, Frances leaned back, just enough to look into Daniel's face again. "I prayed for you. Every birthday. Every Christmas. Every January 19th. Daniel smiled through tears. "I think I heard those prayers." She laughed softly, despite crying. "Your father would say he finally won the argument." "What argument?" "He always insisted hope was stubborn." She reached into her purse. From the old envelope, she carefully removed the handwritten note Nathan had left years before. "If you fold $1 with hope someday, it'll come back carrying a blessing." Daniel read the words twice, then looked up. "I thought I was the blessing." Frances gently touched his cheek. "No." She smiled through tears. "We are." Marcus quietly entered after several more minutes. He had never seen Daniel look so peaceful. Daniel turned toward him. "This is my mother." Marcus smiled warmly. "It's an honor to finally meet you, Mrs. Hayes." Frances laughed through lingering tears. "You've known my son longer than I have." Marcus answered honestly. I've known the man. I've only just met Benjamin. Daniel lowered his head at hearing the name again. Benjamin. It no longer sounded like someone from a forgotten story. It belonged to him. As the church bells began ringing noon across Cleveland, an elderly mother and the son she had never stopped loving stepped out of the chapel together. For everyone else, it was simply another winter Saturday. For them, it was the first day their family had truly begun again. News of the reunion spread far more quickly than either Francis or Daniel expected. Not because they announced it, they didn't. The story escaped through people who had witnessed impossible joy. Pastor Samuel mentioned it to another pastor. Emma Foster told a former co-worker while still wiping away tears. Within days, whispers traveled across Cleveland. An elderly volunteer had found the son she believed lost for 41 years. Reporters soon began calling Brooks Health Systems. Daniel declined every interview. When one television producer offered an exclusive feature, he answered politely, "This story doesn't belong to the media. It belongs to my mother." A week after the reunion, Daniel drove Francis to the cemetery where Nathan Hayes rested. Snow covered the grass in soft white layers. The small headstone stood beneath an old maple tree. Francis knelt slowly despite Daniel's attempt to help. She brushed snow away from Nathan's name with her gloved hand. "I brought someone." Her voice trembled. "He finally came home?" Daniel stood quietly beside her. For several moments he simply looked at the name carved into the stone. Nathan Hayes, his father. A man he had no conscious memories of yet whose kindness had somehow shaped his life anyway. Daniel placed fresh white lilies beside the headstone. "I don't remember your face," he spoke softly. "But I know who you were." He glanced toward Francis. "She never stopped teaching me." A cold winter breeze moved gently through the cemetery. Francis smiled through tears. "He would have liked you." Daniel laughed quietly. "I hope so. He would have been proud." Later that afternoon, Daniel invited Francis to visit his home. She hesitated before agreeing. The black SUV pulled through iron gates and stopped before a beautiful stone residence overlooking Lake Erie. Francis stared through the window. "This is your house." "It is." She looked at him with complete sincerity. "Who cleans all these windows?" Daniel burst into laughter. "You sound disappointed." "I'm thinking whoever cleans them deserves a raise." Marcus, sitting in the front seat, couldn't stop smiling. Inside the home felt elegant, but strangely quiet. Large rooms, beautiful artwork, perfect furniture, very little warmth. Francis slowly walked through the living room. "It's lovely, but lonely." Daniel nodded. "I suppose it was." He led her into the library. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Medical journals filled one wall, history books another. Near the fireplace stood the walnut display case containing the blue button adoption bracelet, and now the reunited family photograph. Francis approached slowly. "You kept everything." "I never knew why." "I just couldn't throw them away." She touched the glass gently. "Neither could I." Daniel smiled. "I was thinking—" "What?" "I'd like these things to stay together." "So would I." As evening approached, Daniel presented a carefully prepared folder. "I have something I'd like to discuss." Francis sat across from him. "I've arranged a new home." She looked puzzled. "A beautiful place. Single story. Close to the church. Private garden. Full-time medical care if you ever need it." He slid photographs across the table. "It's yours." She quietly studied each picture. The house was beautiful, far more than she had ever imagined owning. After several minutes, she gently closed the folder. "No." Daniel blinked. "No. I won't move." You don't like it. I'm sure I'd love it. Then why? Frances smiled kindly. Because my life is already where it belongs. She explained patiently. Mrs. Bishop depended on her to check on elderly tenants. The church children expected her every Wednesday. Walter waited for their Tuesday chess games. Maria called whenever her arthritis flared. My neighborhood isn't just where I live. It's where I'm needed. Daniel looked down. I only wanted you to be comfortable. I already am. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. My son. I spent 41 years praying to see you again. I never prayed for a bigger house. He laughed softly through damp eyes. You always know exactly what to say. I've had plenty of practice. Daniel thought quietly for several minutes. Then he closed the folder. All right. No new house. Frances smiled. Thank you. But, Daniel continued, I'm still your son. She raised an eyebrow. I believe that's official now. I intend to annoy you properly. What does that mean? It means I'm paying for your medication. No. I'm replacing the roof on the boarding house. Daniel, I'm also renovating the church kitchen. She sighed. You're impossible. I inherited that from somebody. She laughed. I wonder who. He grinned. I have a theory. The compromise came naturally. Instead of changing Frances's life, Daniel quietly strengthened the life she already loved. Within 2 months, St. Matthew's Church received anonymous funding for a new food pantry. Mrs. Bishop's boarding house gained safer heating and repaired plumbing. The neighborhood library replaced worn-out children's books. Every donation arrived through community organizations rather than Daniel's company. No plaques, no speeches, no publicity, only help. One afternoon, Frances noticed workers replacing broken steps outside the church. She looked suspiciously at Daniel. You had something to do with this. He looked innocently toward the sky. I have no idea what you're talking about. Marcus coughed to hide a smile. Frances folded her arms. You've become a terrible liar. I'll keep practicing. No. Please don't. She laughed. You're much better at kindness. That Sunday, after church services ended, Daniel remained behind to stack folding chairs. Pastor Samuel watched quietly. You know, the pastor smiled. Most people think miracles happen all at once. Daniel paused. And you? I think miracles arrive one small act at a time. A folded dollar, a loaf of bread, a glass of milk, a song remembered. He looked toward Frances, who was helping children put away crayons. Sometimes people don't realize they're living inside a miracle until years later. Daniel followed his gaze. His mother looked exactly as she always had. Simple coat, gentle smile, serving others before herself. The only difference was that now, whenever she glanced across the room, she no longer wondered whether her little boy was somewhere in the world. She knew. And every time their eyes met, both of them smiled with the quiet certainty that the greatest gift either had ever received was not wealth, success, or even finding each other again. It was discovering that love had remained alive during every one of the 41 years they had been apart. Spring arrived quietly in Cleveland. The heavy snow disappeared, replaced by patches of green that slowly returned to neighborhood parks and church gardens. For Frances Hayes, life looked remarkably familiar. She still woke before sunrise. She still walked to St. Matthew's with a cloth bag full of books for children. She still remembered every birthday in the congregation. Only one thing had changed. Now every Sunday morning, a black SUV occasionally appeared outside the boarding house. Daniel would step out carrying coffee. Morning, Mom. She smiled every single time. No matter how many weeks passed, hearing that word still felt miraculous. One Saturday, Daniel invited Frances to lunch. Instead of an expensive restaurant, he chose the neighborhood diner where they had first shared breakfast together. Mrs. Linda Morales recognized them immediately. "Look who's back." She hugged Francis first, then Daniel. "I knew there was something special about you two." Daniel laughed. "Were we that obvious?" Linda grinned. "The way you looked at each other. Only people searching for family look like that." They ordered exactly what they had eaten the first time. Chicken soup for Francis, turkey sandwich for Daniel. Halfway through lunch, Daniel became unusually thoughtful. "I've been working on something." Francis smiled knowingly. "I've learned that sentence usually costs somebody a lot of money," he laughed. "Probably." "What is it?" Daniel slid a folder across the table. This time Francis looked at it suspiciously. "I'm not moving." "I know." "I'm not accepting a mansion." "I know." "I'm not buying a luxury car." "I know." She folded her arms. "Good." Daniel opened the folder himself. Inside were architectural drawings, not of a house, of a community center. Across the top were the words, "The Nathan and Francis Hayes Family Hope Center." Francis stared silently. "It isn't for us," Daniel said. "It's for people who are where you once were." He explained the vision: a food pantry, temporary emergency housing, medical screenings, legal assistance, a reading room for children, a grief support program for parents searching for missing family members. Everything would be free. Francis slowly turned each page. At the end she stopped. A small plaque design had been included, in honor of Nathan Hayes, who believed hope always returns carrying a blessing. Her eyes filled. "You remembered? I'll never forget." Francis remained quiet for a long time. Finally she asked, "Who suggested all this?" "You did?" "I don't remember." "You never said the words." "You lived them." Daniel leaned forward. "When I wanted to give you a better life." "You taught me something." "A better life isn't always about changing where someone lives. It's about making sure no one feels forgotten." She smiled proudly. "Now you're talking like your father." "I hope that's a compliment." "It's the highest one I know." Construction began 2 months later. Daniel refused to make the project about himself. There were no giant company logos, no advertisements, no media campaign celebrating corporate generosity. Instead, local volunteers painted walls alongside company employees. Doctors donated weekends. Teachers organized children's libraries. Retired carpenters built bookshelves. High school students planted flowers. Francis insisted on working too. Daniel found her carrying boxes one afternoon. "Mom, I'm helping." "Those boxes are heavy." "So is raising you." He laughed. "I don't remember making it easy." "You probably didn't." Marcus watched the exchange with a smile. "It's nice seeing someone win arguments against you." Daniel sighed dramatically. "Oh, I'm beginning to understand why Dad never won." Francis winked. "He didn't mind?" One afternoon, a familiar face appeared outside the construction site. Sophia Bennett. The young, single mother Daniel had previously hired through one of the company's community employment programs. She held the hand of her 7-year-old daughter. "I heard this place was opening." Francis recognized her immediately. "How have you been?" Sophia smiled. "I got promoted. My daughter starts 2nd grade this fall." Daniel looked pleasantly surprised. "Congratulations." Sophia hesitated. "I wanted to volunteer." Francis looked at Daniel, then back at Sophia. "Grab a paintbrush." Within minutes, Sophia was helping paint the children's reading room. Her daughter carefully arranged donated storybooks on low shelves. Watching them, Daniel suddenly realized something beautiful. Kindness had begun traveling farther than either he or Francis could measure. One generous act had quietly become another, then another, then another. Opening day arrived in early autumn. Hundreds of neighbors gathered outside the completed building. Children chased balloons across the lawn. Volunteers served sandwiches and lemonade. Reporters waited respectfully at the back after Daniel requested the ceremony remain focused on the community rather than his company. Pastor Samuel stepped to the microphone first. "This building exists because one woman believed strangers deserved compassion." He looked toward Francis. "And because one son decided gratitude should become action." The crowd applauded warmly. Daniel then approached the podium. He looked at the prepared speech, folded it once, placed it in his pocket. Instead, he spoke from memory. "When I was a child, I lost my family. When I became an adult, I found success. But success never answered the loneliness." He looked toward Francis. "One winter morning, my mother spent her last dollar on a man she believed was homeless. She didn't know he was her son." A quiet silence settled over the crowd. She helped because kindness wasn't something she performed. It was who she was. He smiled gently. "If this center accomplishes anything, I hope it reminds every person who walks through these doors that compassion is never wasted. You may never know whose life you're changing, but change it anyway." The applause lasted several minutes. Then Daniel stepped away from the microphone. He walked directly to Francis. Without saying a word, he gently placed the ceremonial scissors into her hands. "No," she whispered. "This belongs to you." He shook his head. "No. It started with your last dollar." She smiled through tears. "And now look what it bought." Together they cut the ribbon. As families entered the Hope Center for the very first time, sunlight poured through the front windows onto a framed photograph hanging in the entrance hall. It showed a young mother and her little boy, their once burned family photograph, now fully restored. Beneath it were simple words that everyone who entered would read. "Hope is never measured by what you have. Hope is measured by what you're willing to give away." The Hope Center quickly became more than a building. Within 6 months, it had become the heartbeat of the neighborhood. Parents stopped by after work for affordable groceries. Children gathered every afternoon in the reading room. Retired teachers volunteered to tutor students. Doctors offered free health screenings twice a month. But Francis insisted the most important room in the entire building wasn't the pantry or the clinic. It was the small living room near the entrance. "No one should have to tell their story while standing," she often said. "So we give them somewhere to sit first." One rainy Tuesday morning, Francis arrived carrying homemade vegetable soup. As she entered, she noticed a young woman sitting quietly on the couch. Her clothes were clean but worn. A little girl slept with her head resting on the woman's shoulder. The receptionist whispered, "Her name is Melissa." She and her daughter spent the night in their car. Francis nodded gently. "I'll talk to her." She sat beside the young mother without asking questions. Instead, she held out a paper cup. "Soup." Melissa looked embarrassed. "I don't have any money." "I wasn't selling it." The young woman accepted the cup with shaking hands. After several minutes, she quietly admitted the truth. She had escaped an abusive relationship. She had lost her apartment. Every shelter she contacted had been full. "I don't know what to do anymore." Francis listened without interrupting. When Melissa finished, she simply said, "You're safe now." 3 words. Nothing more. Yet Melissa later admitted those words were the first moment she believed life might still change. Daniel arrived later that afternoon for a board meeting being held in one of the Hope Center's conference rooms. As he walked through the lobby, he noticed Frances sitting on the floor. She was coloring with Melissa's daughter. Crayons covered the table. The little girl giggled while Francis proudly displayed a badly drawn butterfly. Daniel smiled. You know that's supposed to have 6 legs. Francis looked at her picture. I gave mine 8. The little girl laughed. It looks funny. It certainly does. Daniel sat beside them. Before long, he was coloring too. Marcus walked past the room, stopped, and quietly took a picture. Not for social media, not for publicity. Only because moments like that deserved remembering. Several weeks later, Melissa returned. This time she wore a company uniform. She had been hired by Brooks Health Systems after completing a job training program funded through the Hope Center. She carried a small envelope. I wanted to return this. Francis looked confused. Inside was $20. The first day we met. You slipped this into my daughter's backpack. I promised myself I'd give it back someday. Francis smiled. Keep it. Melissa shook her head. I can't. You taught me something. What? Someone else needs this $20 now. Francis gently closed Melissa's fingers around the bill again. Then promise me something. What? When you find that person, don't tell them it came from me. Melissa smiled through tears. I promise. Daniel watched the exchange from across the room. He suddenly realized the folded dollar Nathan had once carried had never truly disappeared. Its value had simply multiplied, not as money, as compassion. Later that year, Brooks Health Systems held its annual leadership conference. Executives expected Daniel's keynote address to focus on innovation, artificial intelligence, and expanding healthcare access. Instead, he walked onto the stage carrying a single $1 bill. The audience looked puzzled. Daniel held it up. My father left my mother one piece of advice. He carefully folded the dollar. If you fold a dollar with hope someday, it'll come back carrying a blessing. Several executives smiled politely, unsure where the story was heading. Daniel continued, I used to believe leadership was about making difficult decisions. I was wrong. He glanced toward the front row, where Francis quietly sat beside Pastor Samuel. It's about noticing people everyone else overlooks. He described without revealing private details how one elderly woman had chosen compassion over convenience. She invested $1. The return wasn't financial. It was human. The room fell completely silent. When our company makes decisions from this day forward, the first question will no longer be, how much does this cost? It will be, who does this help? The audience rose in a standing ovation. Francis simply smiled. To her, Daniel wasn't giving a speech. He was becoming the man she had always hoped her little boy would grow up to be. One evening after the conference ended, Daniel drove Francis home. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. As they approached the boarding house, Francis noticed something. The old front porch where she had spent years greeting neighbors had been carefully restored. Flower boxes lined the railing. A new bench sat near the entrance. Mrs. Bishop waved proudly from the doorway. You like it? Francis immediately turned toward Daniel. You promise not to interfere. I promise not to move you. That's different. She laughed. I suppose lawyers would agree. I had excellent legal advice. She shook her head. You're impossible. I've heard that before. Before getting out of the car, Francis reached into her purse. She removed the old envelope that had traveled with her for decades. Inside remained Nathan's handwritten note, the reunited photograph, and one folded dollar. She handed the bill to Daniel. I think it's yours now. He looked surprised. I can't take this. Yes, you can. You've learned what it means. Daniel carefully unfolded it. The paper had become fragile with age. He looked at his mother. What if I lose it? She smiled. You won't. How do you know? Because by now, It isn't really the dollar you're carrying. He nodded slowly. He finally understood. The blessing had never been inside the bill. It had always been inside the choice to give when giving felt impossible. As Francis walked toward the boarding house, Daniel remained in the driver's seat for another minute. He carefully folded the dollar exactly the way Nathan had taught decades earlier. Then he slipped it into his wallet. Not as money, as a promise. A promise that every opportunity to help another person would be treated as the beginning of a story whose ending he might never see, but whose impact could last a lifetime. 5 years later, the first snow of December drifted gently across Cleveland, covering rooftops and sidewalks in the same quiet white blanket that had once witnessed the hardest days of Francis Hayes's life. Now it covered something different. Hope. The Nathan and Francis Hayes Family Hope Center had expanded into 3 locations across Ohio. More than 40,000 families had received food assistance. Thousands of children had attended after-school reading programs. Hundreds of people had found permanent employment through partnerships with local businesses. Yet every visitor noticed the same thing. No matter how large the organization became, the woman sitting in the welcoming room every Tuesday morning still introduced herself simply as Francis. Not founder, not honored guest, just Francis. She still poured coffee for strangers. She still remembered birthdays. She still listened far more than she spoke. One snowy afternoon, a teenage volunteer asked her, "Mrs. Hayes, why don't you have a bigger office?" Francis smiled. "If I sit behind a big desk, people might think they need permission to talk to me." The teenager nodded thoughtfully. Years later, he would repeat that lesson to someone else. Daniel Brooks had changed as well. His company continued growing, but employees noticed something far more important than rising profits. Every executive meeting now began with one empty chair placed beside the conference table. New managers often asked about it. Daniel always answered the same way. "That chair belongs to the person most affected by our decision. They're not in the room. So before we vote, we imagine they are." It changed everything. Hospital closures were reconsidered. Employee assistance programs expanded. Scholarships increased. Board members eventually stopped questioning the tradition. They simply pulled out the empty chair before Daniel even arrived. One Saturday morning, Daniel visited the boarding house. Mrs. Bishop, now comfortably retired after the building had been renovated and placed into a non-profit housing trust, welcomed him inside. "She's upstairs. You know the way." Daniel climbed the familiar staircase. The small room looked almost unchanged. The same quilt, the same rocking chair, the same framed photograph of Nathan. Only one addition stood beside the window. A newer photograph. Daniel and Francis smiling together at the Hope Center's opening ceremony. Francis looked up from her knitting. "You're early. I brought breakfast. Again. You've stopped pretending to complain." "I know. It saves time." They laughed. Daniel placed a paper bag on the table. Blueberry muffins, fresh fruit, coffee. Exactly what she liked. As they ate, Francis looked toward the window where snowflakes drifted softly through the morning light. "Do you remember the first day we met again?" Daniel smiled. "I was pretending to be homeless. You were terrible at it. I thought I was convincing. You thanked people too politely." He laughed. "That gave me away." "No. It was your shoes." "My shoes? No homeless man wears shoes that expensive." Daniel covered his face. "I can't believe you noticed." "I notice everything." "You certainly do." They laughed until tears formed in their eyes. Not from sadness, from the simple joy of having enough ordinary mornings together to create memories neither would ever lose. Later that afternoon, the Hope Center celebrated its annual Community Day. Families filled the courtyard. Children built snowmen. Local musicians played Christmas songs. Melissa, now director of family services, supervised volunteers. Her daughter, no longer the frightened little girl who had once slept in a car, proudly led younger children through the reading room. Sophia Bennett managed the Employment Resource Center, helping dozens of parents prepare for job interviews each month. Walter still played chess every Tuesday. Pastor Samuel still blessed every community meal. Lives once connected by hardship had become connected by purpose. During the celebration, a little boy tugged on Daniel's sleeve. "Mr. Yes, my mom says you're the boss." Daniel smiled. "Sometimes." The boy held out a crumpled $1 bill. "I want to help somebody." Daniel looked at the bill, then at the child. "That's a wonderful idea. But don't spend it yet." He carefully folded the dollar exactly the way Nathan had taught him, then handed it back. "Keep it until someone needs it more than you do." The little boy studied the folded bill. Will it really become a blessing? Daniel looked across the courtyard toward Frances. She was laughing with 3 children while helping them decorate cookies. He smiled. "It already has." As evening fell, everyone gathered for the annual candle lighting ceremony. Hundreds of small lights glowed against the winter sky. Daniel stepped to the microphone. He didn't prepare a speech anymore. He never needed one. "My mother once believed she had lost everything." He looked toward Frances. "But she still chose kindness." "That choice brought me home." He paused. "Many people think miracles begin with extraordinary people. I don't. I think miracles begin with ordinary people making extraordinary choices." He stepped away from the microphone. Instead of continuing, he invited Frances forward. The crowd applauded as she slowly approached. She looked at all the familiar faces. Some had once received help. Others had once volunteered. Many had done both. She spoke quietly. "I've lived long enough to learn something. When I was young, I believed generosity meant giving what you could spare." She smiled gently. "I was wrong. Real generosity begins when giving costs something." Her hand rested lightly over her heart. "My last dollar didn't make me poor. It reminded me who I wanted to be." She looked at Daniel. "And God gave me back far more than I ever imagined." Silence settled over the courtyard. Not awkward silence, the kind created when every heart is listening. Frances lifted her candle. "If you leave here remembering only one thing, remember this. You never know what battle another person is fighting. You never know who they might become. You never know how one small act of kindness may return to you years later. So be kind anyway." The crowd raised their candles. Tiny lights shimmered across the snowy evening. Daniel walked over and gently took his mother's hand. For a moment, neither spoke. They didn't need to. 41 lost years could never be replaced. But they had learned something even more valuable. Love is not measured by the time people spend together. It is measured by the faith that refuses to disappear while they are apart. As the first Christmas bells echoed across the city, mother and son stood side by side, surrounded by lives forever changed by a single folded dollar and one simple decision made on a cold winter morning. Sometimes the greatest blessing doesn't arrive as money, success, or recognition. Sometimes it arrives disguised as the chance to help a stranger. And sometimes, if hope has been patient enough, that stranger turns out to be family. Life has a remarkable way of returning what we give to the world, but rarely in the way we expect. Frances never imagined that the last dollar she spent on a stranger would one day lead her back to the son she had mourned for over 4 decades. She didn't help because she expected a reward, recognition, or repayment. She helped because kindness was part of who she was, even when she had almost nothing left. That's the true lesson of this story. Your greatest wealth is not measured by what you own, but by the compassion you choose to share. A single act of generosity can become the turning point in someone else's life, and sometimes in your own. We may never know how far one kind word, one helping hand, or one selfless sacrifice will travel. But every act of love leaves a mark that time cannot erase. So whenever life gives you the chance to choose between indifference and kindness, choose kindness. You may never see the full story your decision begins, but that doesn't make it any less meaningful. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced an unexpected act of kindness that changed your life? Or has your own kindness ever come back to you in a way you never imagined? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience may inspire someone who needs hope today. And if you enjoy uplifting stories about compassion, resilience, family, and second chances, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next heartfelt story. Thank you for watching, and remember, kindness is never wasted. It always finds its way home.